Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be stepping into a world that most people only think they understand.
Mhm.
The BDSM community.
Okay.
And not just any BDSM community. We're diving deep into the San Francisco scene
Oh.
in the early 2000s, guided by the fascinating ethnographic research of Dr. Margot Weiss.
You're in for a fascinating ride, that's for sure. Dr. Rice didn't just send out surveys, you see. She really embedded herself in the community, attending munches, parties, even a charity auction with BDSM play involved. Talk about getting your hands dirty
It's a
right.
charity option. That's not the first thing that pops into my head when I think about BDSM, I have to admit. It paints a different picture, wouldn't you say? More organized, more out in the open than, say, the cliche of a hidden dungeon.
It definitely challenges our preconceived notions. See, one of the key things Weiss's research unveils is this evolution of the BDSM community. There was the old guard, often centered around physical spaces, like the infamous Folsom Street in San Francisco, but by the time the 2000s rolled around, a new guard was making its presence known.
Okay, so we've got the new guard. What sets them apart? What makes them so new?
Picture this. It's the era of Silicon Valley's rise, the internet is exploding, and San Francisco is a hotbed for tech and change. That's the world this new guard emerges from. They're digitally connected, more dispersed geographically, and they mirror the changing landscape of the Bay Area.
So instead of everyone congregating in a specific location, they're online networking and meeting in, well, less expected places, I'm guessing.
You've hit the nail on the head, and that's where munches enter the picture. Think regular social gatherings,
Yep.
restaurants, cafes, that kind of vibe. These aren't your full leather whips and chains affairs, though.
Right.
Dr. Weiss actually used munches as her entry point, observing and participating, to truly understand the dynamics from within.
So more like a BDSM social club meets brunch. I'm picturing everyone sipping mimosas and discussing rope techniques. Was it obvious who was there for the munch and who was just an innocent bystander?
Not quite, and that's what's so fascinating. Munches were intentionally low-key, held in public spaces. No BDSM gear or play allowed. It was all about connection and socializing in an everyday setting.
Wow, that really flips the script on the image of BDSM being this hidden, secretive thing. It almost sounds, dare I say, normal.
It's a side of the community most people don't see, and there's a surprising amount of variety within these munches, too. Dr. Weiss found groups for different races and ethnicities, sexual orientations, even specialized interests within BDSM itself. Imagine finding your niche, your own little corner of the world, even within a subculture.
You're right, this is making me completely rethink my assumptions. It's clearly a lot more multifaceted and nuanced than just whips and chains, which I realize now is a bit of a silly thing to say.
Don't worry, you're not alone. There's a learning curve for everyone when it comes to understanding BDSM. And that complexity we're talking about, it really takes center stage when we look at how the community defines itself and its practices. And believe me, it's far more intricate than meets the eye.
This is already so fascinating. I'm hooked. Let's dive deeper, shall we? What did Dr. Weiss discover about the practitioners themselves?
One thing that you might find surprising is the emphasis on rules and safety within the BDSM community. It's not just about letting loose, there's a real focus on, doing so responsibly.
Ah, you're talking about the famous safe, sane, and consensual principle, or SSC as I've heard it called. It seems to be a bit of a cornerstone in the BDSM world.
You got it. For the new guard especially, SSC wasn't just a catchy phrase, it was crucial. They saw it as the bedrock for a responsible and ethical environment, a way to ensure everyone feels safe and respected while exploring these intense experiences.
That makes a lot of sense. But I'm curious, did everyone agree on what safe, sane, and consensual actually meant in practice? I imagine there's room for interpretation there and potentially some disagreements.
That's where it gets really interesting. Dr. Weiss observed that there is a spectrum of opinions on rules and their enforcement. Some community members felt that excessive rules felt restrictive, almost like imposing political correctness onto a space that should prioritize personal freedom.
So you had this clash between those who wanted more structure, more clearly defined boundaries, and those who felt it went against the essence of BDSM, which is often about pushing boundaries.
Exactly. Think about organizations like the Society of Janus or events like the Folsom Street Fair. They had meticulously crafted rules down to the specifics of how certain types of play should be conducted.
I can see how that level of regulation might make some people bristle, especially if they view BDSM as a space for transgression and challenging norms. But on the flip side, I can also understand the need for some guidelines, especially as the community grows and becomes more diverse.
You're hitting on a crucial point. Remember the HIV/AIDS epidemic and its devastating impact on the community in the 80s? That tragic period really underscored the need for safe practices. Organizations like the Society of Janus emerged as a response, focusing on education, training, creating a framework for safer BDSM play.
It does seem paradoxical, doesn't it? Having these formal structures within a subculture, often perceived as rebellious and transgressive.
That's the fascinating tension at play here. It's about balancing the desire to challenge norms and explore the edges of desire with the understanding that safety and respect are paramount. Finding that equilibrium is no easy feat.
It sounds like a delicate dance between freedom and responsibility. And speaking of exploring desires, we can't forget about the toys. They're kind of an integral part of the BDSM experience, wouldn't you say?
They are indeed, and they represent far more than meets the eye. In fact, Dr. Weiss found that practitioners often invest significantly in their toy bags, sometimes shelling out thousands of dollars.
Thousands of dollars. Wow, that's a serious commitment. So it's safe to say there's more to it than just grabbing whatever looks intriguing at the store.
Absolutely. These aren't just objects, they're tools that can profoundly shape the BDSM experience. We're talking about enabling specific sensations, amplifying power dynamics, even safely exploring the limits of the human body. It's a whole other dimension of exploration.
I never really thought about it that way, but it makes perfect sense. For example, does a certain type of flogger, and forgive me if I'm using the wrong terminology here, produce a different sensation than, say, another one?
You're spot on with the terminology, no need to apologize.
Yeah.
And you've hit on a key point. Take floggers, for instance. Dr. Weiss describes how different materials and construction techniques, think braided leather versus single strands, can produce a whole range of sensations, from sharp and intense to soft and diffused. There's a deep well of knowledge there.
That's incredible. It's like a whole science, an art form even. It makes you wonder, Theo, with all these different toys and techniques, does it create a sort of hierarchy within the community? Like, do those with the most elaborate, most expensive toys have more status?
It's a valid question, one that Dr. Weiss grappled with too. Some members did worry about BDSM becoming too commercialized, potentially creating barriers for those with less disposable income. However, there was also a strong counter-narrative that emphasized skill and experience as being far more valuable than simply owning expensive toys.
So it's not just about the tools themselves, but how you use them, the knowledge you bring to the experience, the respect and responsibility you demonstrate.
Precisely. It's about understanding the nuances of sensation, navigating power dynamics with care, and always prioritizing safety and consent. Dr. Weiss even documented a whole subculture dedicated to crafting high-quality BDSM toys with a focus on artistry and craftsmanship.
That's fascinating. It sounds like there's a real emphasis on knowledge and mastery within the BDSM community. It's almost like an art form in itself. But so far, we've mainly focused on what happens within the community itself. It's hard to imagine that it doesn't sometimes, spill over into everyday life. How do practitioners navigate those two worlds?
You're right, it's not always a clean separation, is it? And Dr. Weiss found that this intersection of BDSM and everyday life was a source of both excitement and tension for many practitioners. On the one hand, BDSM could be a space for exploring desires that challenged or subverted societal norms.
Do you have any examples of this from your deep dive into her research? I'm curious to see how these abstract ideas actually play out in someone's life.
Absolutely. One woman Dr. Weiss interviewed, Gretchen, really enjoyed being a submissive. However, her lesbian friend expressed concern about the power dynamic, especially since Gretchen often played with men. Her friend saw it as reinforcing traditional gender roles.
Oh, wow. That's getting into some really complex territories. Like, those societal norms are so ingrained, they even influence how we perceive something as personal and intimate as BDSM. So how did Gretchen respond to her friend's concerns?
Gretchen saw it as a matter of choice. She argued that if she was freely choosing to be submissive, it wasn't about giving up her power, but about exploring a part of herself that she found fulfilling.
So it's about reclaiming those roles and desires, owning them rather than being defined by them. It sounds like BDSM can be a powerful tool for self-discovery and challenging societal expectations.
Exactly. For many, it's about agency and empowerment, even in roles that might seem counterintuitive from a traditional perspective. But, as you can imagine, things aren't always so clear-cut. There are times when those lines get blurred, when BDSM intersects with real-world power dynamics in ways that are harder to reconcile.
You're really making me think about all of this in a whole new light. It's easy to make assumptions, but the reality is far more nuanced. Are there any particular areas where Dr. Weiss found these complexities to be most pronounced?
One area that stands out, and it's undeniably sensitive, is the topic of race play. specifically scenarios involving Nazi and slave role-playing.
I can only imagine how charged and controversial that must be, both within the community and outside of it.
It is. Dr. Weiss is very upfront about the sensitivity of this topic, emphasizing that her goal was to understand these practices, not to endorse them. She found it sparked intense debate within the BDSM community itself, reflecting broader societal struggles with race and power.
It's like holding a mirror up to society's darkest corners, even within a space that's meant to be about fantasy and exploration. What were some of the different perspectives that Dr. Weiss encountered on this type of race play?
Some practitioners viewed it as purely fantasy, a way to explore taboo desires in a controlled environment, separate from real-world issues of race and power. They argued that these desires didn't necessarily translate into harmful actions or beliefs outside of the scene.
So a sort of compartmentalization where what happens in that space stays in that space. And what about those who disagreed with that perspective?
Others felt deeply uncomfortable with it, concerned that it could perpetuate harmful stereotypes or even trigger genuine trauma, especially for those who had experienced real-world racism or oppression. They saw it as impossible to separate fantasy from reality entirely, especially with something as loaded as race.
It's such a difficult issue, and I appreciate how Dr. Weiss delved into those complexities. It seems like there are no easy answers here. Did she come across any examples of individuals trying to bridge this divide or use BDSM as a way to confront these challenging issues head on?
She did. She talks about a woman named Milena who staged a very realistic slave auction at a BDSM event. Now, before you jump to conclusions, her intention was to provoke thought and discomfort, to force people to confront the historical and social realities of slavery, even in the context of fantasy and play.
Wow. That's a really powerful example of how BDSM can be used as a platform for social commentary and critique, even within the community itself. It's like she's saying, we can't just ignore these issues, even in our fantasies, we have to confront them.
Exactly. It speaks to the potential for BDSM to not only challenge individual boundaries, but also spark broader conversations about power, privilege, and representation. It's not just about escaping reality, but about engaging with it, even its darkest aspects, in a way that promotes awareness and understanding.
This deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening. I feel like I've barely scratched the surface of such a complex and often misunderstood world.
And that's the beauty of it. It challenges our preconceived notions and invites us to question what we think we know about desire, identity, and the boundaries between fantasy and reality.
Before we wrap up, is there anything in Dr. Weiss's research that really stuck with you? Something that's surprised you or shifted your perspective on BDSM?
You know, what struck me most was the sheer diversity of experiences and perspectives within the community. It's not a monolith, not by any stretch. There's this constant negotiation between individual desires, community values, and societal norms. It's messy, it's challenging, but it's also incredibly human.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It reminds us that even in subcultures that seem so different from the mainstream, we're all ultimately grappling with the same fundamental questions of identity, belonging, and the pursuit of pleasure and connection.
Well said. And let's not forget the incredible resilience of this community. Despite facing discrimination, stigma, and even legal challenges over the years, they've built a vibrant and complex world with its own rules, rituals, and forms of expression.
It's a testament to the power of community, the need for spaces where people can explore their authentic selves without judgment.
Absolutely. And for anyone listening who's intrigued and wants to delve deeper into this world, I highly recommend checking out Dr. Margot Weiss's book, Techniques of Pleasure. It's a fascinating and thought-provoking read that will challenge your assumptions and leave you with a lot to ponder.
I second that recommendation wholeheartedly. And on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey into the heart of the BDSM community. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those conversations going.